I never thought retirement would lead me to witness murder. The Harmony of the Seas departed Miami on February 17th, carrying over 5,000 souls into the Caribbean. I was alone among them, a 58-year-old widower still learning to exist without Eleanor's morning coffee ritual, her evening news commentary, her lavender soap scenting our empty house. My daughter insisted I needed this cruise. "Dad, you can't stay locked in that house forever." 14 months since the funeral, and I still caught myself buying 2 of everything at the grocery store. Cabin 7A became my floating prison of solitude. Across the narrow corridor, behind the door, marked 7C, lived the Pritchards. I first encountered Deanna on embarkation day. Auburn hair, quick smile, the kind of woman who made friends in elevator rides. She held the door when I fumbled with my camera bag. "First cruise?" Her voice carried genuine warmth. "That obvious? You'll love it. I'm Dee." Through the open cabin door, I glimpsed her husband Lyle, wrestling with the electronic safe, his jaw tight with frustrated concentration. Tall, graying temples, the kind of man who never asked for directions. "Warren, retired teacher, still figuring out what comes next. Best advice? Pace yourself at the buffet." She winked and vanished inside. That evening, I ate alone in the main dining room while watching the Pritchards at the adjacent table. Dee animated every conversation, gesturing with wine-flushed enthusiasm. Lyle smiled, but rarely spoke, his attention drifting to his phone between courses. I recognized the pattern. 37 years of marriage to Eleanor had taught me the language of couples navigating familiar silences. The next morning in Cozumel, I joined a ruins tour to escape the ship's oppressive festivity. Ancient Mayan stones provided blessed distraction from cruise ship karaoke and poolside bingo. I photographed weathered glyphs while tourists posed for selfies, finding comfort in my camera's mechanical precision. Back aboard by afternoon, I discovered Glenna Ashford reading in a quiet corner of Deck 5. Gray hair, turquoise glasses, traveling alone while her sister spent divorce money at the spa. We bonded over shared solitude. She'd lost her husband 6 years prior to a sudden stroke. "They tell you grief gets easier," she said, watching families splash in the pools below. "Really, you just get stronger at carrying it." We talked until sunset about lost bookstores and forgotten history lessons. For the first time since Eleanor's death, conversation felt natural rather than forced. Monday brought Grand Cayman's tourist shops and overpriced coffee. I wandered alone, buying postcards I'd never send, feeling displaced among the cheerful crowds. That evening, I encountered the Pritchards returning from dinner. Dee wore a blue dress that caught the promenade lights. Lyle walked behind her, hands pocketed, expression unreadable. As they passed, I caught fragments of conversation. "My bonus paid for the upgrade." Dee's laugh carried genuine joy, but Lyle's jaw tightened perceptibly. A small marital friction, the kind Eleanor and I had navigated countless times. Tuesday evening found me sharing quiet drinks with Glenna in the jazz bar. We discussed grandchildren she cherished and gardens I'd abandoned. Normal widow conversation, 2 people learning to rebuild lives around absence. Around 9:30, I returned to Deck 7. The corridor stretched empty under harsh fluorescent lighting, most passengers still enjoying shows and casinos. I swiped my keycard, stepped inside, and set down my camera. That's when I heard the shout. Male voice, muffled but unmistakably angry, coming from 7C. Then Dee's voice rising. "Don't you dare!" Something heavy crashed to the floor. I froze, one hand still gripping my camera strap. Couples argue, I told myself, especially when trapped together on vacation. But then came the scream. Raw, animal terror that cut through the ship's ambient hum like broken glass. My heart hammered as I grabbed my phone and stepped into the corridor. From behind 7C's door came more sounds. Thumping, begging, a woman's voice pleading, "Lyle, please, please stop!" Another passenger emerged from 7B, Vernon, gray crew cut, moving with military precision. Behind him, his wife Isla, face pale with recognition. "Call security," Vernon commanded. To me, "Stay back." Before either of us could act, 7C's door exploded outward. Deanna stumbled into the hallway, her blue dress torn at the shoulder, blood streaming from her nose in dark drops against the beige carpet. Her eyes found mine, wide, desperate, but before she could speak, a hand seized her from behind and yanked her back inside. The door slammed. The lock clicked. From within came sounds I'll never forget. Furniture splintering, Deanna screaming, then choking, then falling silent in a way that made silence itself unbearable. Vernon threw his shoulder against the door. Once, twice. On the third impact, the frame splintered, and we crashed inside. The cabin looked like a hurricane had torn through it. Overturned lamp, cracked mirror, bed sheets tangled across the floor like abandoned shrouds, and in the narrow space between the bed and bathroom door, Lyle Pritchard knelt over his wife. His hands were around her throat. Deanna's face had turned purple, her fingers clawing weakly at his wrists before falling limp. Her eyes stared at nothing, reflecting the cabin's overhead lights like broken glass. "Get off her!" Vernon grabbed Lyle from behind, trying to break his grip. Lyle swung backward with his elbow, catching Vernon in the ribs, but the older man held on. They crashed into the dresser. A framed photo, the Pritchards with two young men, their sons, fell and shattered across the floor. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, my mind refusing to process what my eyes witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, surrounded by steel drum music and chocolate, fountains and people drinking fruity cocktails with little umbrellas. Lyle suddenly released his grip, not because Vernon had overpowered him, but because he simply stopped. His hands fell to his sides as he stared down at Deanna's motionless body with vague confusion, like someone waking from a dream they couldn't quite remember. "Isla!" Vernon shouted toward the corridor. "Get in here, now!" His wife rushed past me, dropped beside Deanna, and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Finding nothing, she immediately began chest compressions. "Call medical!" she barked at me. "Dial 0. Tell them Deck 7, Cabin C, emergency." My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped my phone. The operator answered on the second ring. I stammered out the information while watching Isla work with professional efficiency, breathing into Deanna's mouth, counting compressions, repeating the cycle with desperate precision. Lyle stood against the far wall, Vernon positioned between him and the women. His face showed no emotion. Not anger anymore. Not anything. Just a terrible, empty blankness. "Why?" Vernon's voice was low, controlled, but I heard the rage underneath. "Why did you do it?" Lyle blinked slowly. When he spoke, his voice was conversational, almost polite. "She called me fragile." He said it like those 3 words explained everything, like they constituted a complete justification. Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers in crisp white uniforms, followed by medical personnel with emergency equipment. They took over from Isla, working over Deanna's body with focused intensity, while one officer restrained Lyle with plastic zip ties. The other herded us into the corridor. I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly unreliable. Other passengers had emerged from their cabins, drawn by the commotion. They stood in doorways whispering, phones recording, a woman in a bathrobe asking what happened. No one answered. The medical team worked for 18 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone, each minute stretching into something vast and terrible. Finally, the team leader, a woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, emerged from the cabin. She spoke quietly to the security officers. I couldn't hear the words, but I understood her slow, defeated headshake. Deanna Pritchard was dead. The ship's PA system crackled. "Medical team to Deck 7, midship." Then, "All guests, please remain in your staterooms. This is a precautionary measure only." But everyone on Deck 7 knew it wasn't precautionary. They'd heard the screams. They'd seen blood on the carpet. They'd watched security lead Lyle Pritchard away in handcuffs, his expression still eerily vacant, as if his mind had simply departed his body and left behind only an empty shell. Glenna found me an hour later in the jazz bar, now empty except for a shell-shocked bartender. I told her everything while she held my trembling hand the way Eleanor used to when the world felt too heavy to bear. "You couldn't have stopped it," she said, quietly. "I know, but knowing and believing are different countries entirely." The ship continued toward Jamaica, but there would be no shore excursions. FBI agents would board in Montego Bay. The remaining 4 days, scheduled festivities, planned entertainment, now felt like a grotesque parade we were all forced to continue. That night, I sat on my balcony watching black water slide past under stars Eleanor would have loved. Somewhere below, in the ship's morgue, Deanna Pritchard lay under a white sheet. Somewhere in a locked security room, Lyle Pritchard sat with his fragile ego and the unspeakable thing he'd done. I finally understood that horror doesn't announce itself with creaking doors and supernatural shadows. It walks beside you in daylight. It shares anniversary dinners and vacation photos. It wears a wedding ring and remembers birthdays, and then, without warning, reaches across decades of shared life and destroys everything in minutes. The ship's engines hummed their constant lullaby. Around me, thousands of people slept or tried to sleep, trusting thin walls and the illusion of safety. I never slept again. Not really. Not after learning that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who love you. 26 years in corporate risk assessment had taught me to read the signs others missed. Standing on the observation deck of the Northern Majesty as we cut through Alaska's Inside Passage, I felt that familiar prickle of unease, the same instinct that had saved my career more times than I could count. My name is Quentin Mercer, and I was aboard this cruise ship for one reason: to conduct a comprehensive safety evaluation for the vessel's insurance renewal. What should have been routine paperwork became personal when my most valuable client, Clifford Ashford, decided to bring his family along for the week-long voyage from Seattle to Vancouver. Clifford owned the largest timber operation in the Pacific Northwest, and his account kept my consultancy firm profitable. His 16-year-old son Donovan was an exceptional kid, quiet, intensely focused on his wildlife photography, with an artist's eye that captured details most people overlooked. The boy reminded me painfully of my own son at that age, before the accident that took him from me 15 years ago. The Northern Majesty carried only 180 passengers, small by industry standards, but still large enough for someone to disappear without a trace. During my initial safety inspection, I documented 17 security blind spots where CCTV coverage failed, mostly service corridors and storage areas where passengers had no business being. On our second day out of Ketchikan, as we cruised through the ethereal beauty of Glacier Bay, Donovan vanished during the afternoon wildlife viewing session. Vera Ashford found his cabin empty at dinner time, expensive camera equipment scattered across the unmade bed as if abandoned mid-task. "Mr. Mercer," Captain Morrison said, as we gathered in the guest services office, his weathered face grave with concern. "In 30 years on these waters, I've learned that teenagers sometimes lose track of time exploring, but this feels different." I've been thinking the same thing. During my systematic inspection of the ship, I'd noticed subtle irregularities: crew members who seemed to avoid certain areas, passengers who reported feeling watched in specific corridors, and most disturbing, a pattern of missing person reports from similar cruise lines over the past 5 years. Always young people, always those with artistic talents. The search began at sunset, when the Alaskan sky turned the color of dried blood. Security teams divided the ship into sectors, checking every public space, every cabin, every conceivable hiding place. I volunteered to help, my risk assessment training making me valuable in systematic searches. That's when I first encountered him. A tall figure in an expensive black wool coat stood motionless at the stern rail on Deck 7, barely visible in the gathering twilight. Something about his posture, the unnatural stillness, the way his head turned slowly to track movement on the lower decks, triggered every professional instinct I possessed. Approached casually, cataloging details as I'd been trained. 6'1", maybe 6'2". The coat was beautifully tailored, but showed wear patterns suggesting years of use. No cruise ship lanyard, no camera, none of the typical tourist accessories. His hands, when briefly visible, were pale and smooth, the hands of someone who had never performed manual labor. "Beautiful evening for a search," I said, stopping within conversational distance. He turned slowly, and I got my first clear look at his face. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair that could have been styled decades ago, and eyes that seemed to capture and hold too much light. There was something ageless about him. He could have been 30 or 60, impossible to determine. "Mr. Mercer," he said, using my name, though I'd never introduced myself. "Your safety evaluations are quite thorough. You document every vulnerability on vessels like this one." The accent was cultured, but placeless, as if he'd learned English from many different sources over a long period of time. More unsettling was his knowledge of my work. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" He smiled, an expression that never reached those two bright eyes. "I know many people, Mr. Mercer, especially those with particular talents, like young Donovan." Before I could respond, my radio crackled with urgent chatter. Security had found something on Deck 3, a service corridor that should have been locked. When I looked back, the man was gone. not walking away, simply absent, as if the evening mist had swallowed him completely. The discovery on Deck 3 was Donovan's camera lens cap, found in a maintenance corridor 30 feet from where the CCTV coverage ended. The area smelled of salt air and something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. As midnight approached, the search intensified. Clifford's face had gone ashen, and Vera clutched his arm with white knuckles. I found myself thinking about patterns, about the missing person reports I'd researched. All young people between 15 and 25, all with artistic abilities, photographers, painters, musicians, all vanished from cruise ships in remote waters where search and rescue operations faced significant challenges. The fog began rolling in just after 11 p.m., thick and unnatural, moving against the wind patterns I'd observed all day. Within an hour, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The ship's navigation systems compensated automatically, but something about the mist felt wrong. Too dense, too uniform, as if it had been summoned rather than formed naturally. At 12:47 a.m., my radio crackled with Chief Ramirez's voice. "All teams to Deck 1 forward. We found them." The scene on the forward deck defied every rational explanation my analytical mind tried to construct. Donovan stood at the bow rail in perfect stillness, his young face blank and eerily serene despite the chaos of the search around him. The man in the black coat stood slightly. Behind him, one pale hand resting on the boy's shoulder in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. The fog swirled around them like a living thing, thicker here than anywhere else on the ship. In the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights, both figures seemed to shimmer, as if seen through water. "Donovan!" Clifford's voice cracked with relief and terror as he pushed past the security team. The boy turned slowly, his movements dreamlike and unnaturally fluid. When his eyes found his father, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Recognition flickered there, but it was distant, as if Donovan were looking at us from across a vast chasm of space and time. "Dad?" His voice was his own, but hollow. "What time is it?" I was taking pictures of the aurora. I looked up instinctively. The sky was thick with fog and clouds. There was no aurora. Chief Ramirez moved to surround the stranger, but the man seemed utterly unconcerned by the presence of armed security. He looked directly at me, and in that moment, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. Those eyes held knowledge that predated written history, patient, ancient, and impossibly hungry. "Your son has a remarkable gift, Mr. Ashford," the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "He sees beyond the surface of things. Through his lens, he captures essences." "What did you do to him?" Clifford demanded, pulling Donovan away from the rail. The stranger's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "I showed him truth. There are layers of existence invisible to ordinary perception. Your son's artistic vision allows him to glimpse these deeper realities. I collect such talents." That word, collect, sent ice through my veins. Not recruit, not teach. Collect. "The others," I said, pieces falling into place. "The missing passengers from other ships. You took them." "I preserved them," he corrected, his tone suggesting I had misunderstood something fundamental. "Artists like Donovan burn bright but brief. Their vision fades with age, corrupted by cynicism and compromise. I ensure their gifts achieve immortality." Donovan shuddered violently, wrapping his arms around himself. "He showed me photographs," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Pictures of people like me. They were still taking pictures, but they weren't really there anymore." The stranger's expression remained serene. "They create beautiful work now, freed from the limitations of flesh, from the distractions of mortal concerns. Their art has achieved perfection." "You're insane," Clifford snarled, but I could hear the fear beneath his anger. "I am patient," the stranger replied. "I have waited centuries for talents like your son's to emerge. The invention of photography opened new possibilities, the ability to capture not just images, but fragments of souls, pieces of the invisible world that surrounds us." "Chief Key." Ramirez reached for his radio, but the device died with a sharp burst of static. All around us, the emergency lighting began to flicker. The ship's engines, which had hummed constantly beneath our feet, fell silent. In the growing darkness, the stranger's form seemed to expand, his coat billowing impossibly wide. The fog pressed closer, and I caught glimpses of other figures moving within it. Young people with cameras and paintbrushes, their eyes empty of everything human. "The ocean keeps its secrets well," the stranger continued, his voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Tragic accidents happen in these dangerous waters. Equipment failures, storm damage. Your reports will reflect these unfortunate realities, Mr. Mercer." But something had changed in Donovan. The distant look in his eyes was sharpening, focusing. Whatever hold the entity had maintained was weakening, perhaps because of his father's presence or the intervention of the security team, or something deeper I couldn't understand. "No," Donovan said quietly, then louder. "No, I won't go with you." The stranger's serene expression flickered for the first time. "You have already seen beyond the veil. The knowledge cannot be undone. You belong with us now." That's when I understood. The entity couldn't simply take them. It needed willing participation, artists who would choose immortality over mortality, perfection over humanity. Donovan's refusal was breaking some fundamental rule of its existence. The boy raised his camera. I hadn't even noticed him retrieving it, and pointed it directly at the stranger. Through the viewfinder, I caught a glimpse of what Donovan was seeing. The entity's true form, ancient and terrible and beautiful in its hungry perfection. The camera's flash erupted like a small sun, cutting through the fog with harsh white light. The stranger screamed, a sound like wind through broken glass, and his carefully maintained human facade shattered. For one impossible moment, I saw what he truly was. Something vast and old that had learned to wear human shapes like costumes, fed on creative souls, and had been hunting for longer than human civilization had existed. Then the emergency lighting blazed back to life. The ship's engines resumed their steady hum, and the fog began to dissipate. Where the stranger had stood, only wet footprints remained on the deck, leading to the rail and ending at the edge, as if their maker had simply stepped off into the night air, 300 feet above the dark Alaskan waters. Donovan collapsed into his father's arms, the camera falling from nerveless fingers. When I checked the device later, every photograph from that night showed only gray static, except one. The final image captured something that made my hands shake, a vast shadow moving beneath the ocean's surface, keeping pace with our ship. We reached Vancouver without further incident. I filed my safety report, noting equipment failures and recommending improved emergency procedures. Donovan spent 3 days in the hospital, officially diagnosed with exhaustion and hypothermia. He never spoke publicly of what happened during those missing hours, but he never took another photograph. His artistic vision, the gift that had nearly cost him everything, had simply vanished, as if the confrontation with the entity had burned it from his soul entirely. Sometimes I wonder if that was the price of his freedom, or if it was the only thing that kept the collector from returning to claim what it believed was rightfully his. The fog never lifted until we reached port, and I swear I felt those ancient eyes watching us until the moment we stepped onto solid ground. I booked the 7-night Alaska sailing of the Radiance of the Seas that left Seattle on a gray Thursday afternoon in early September 2008. The ship nosed past the Space Needle and into Puget Sound under low clouds that promised rain. I had been working double shifts at Boeing for 18 months straight, finalizing specifications for the 787 wing assembly, and the idea of glaciers and silence felt like medicine. My name is Warren Gillis. I am 58 years old, recently divorced, and I had never taken a cruise alone before. The cabin on Deck 7 was smaller than I expected, with a porthole that framed nothing but gray water. I unpacked my DSLR camera, hung my rain jacket, and stood there wondering what people do with themselves on vacation when there is no one to talk to. By evening, we were well past the San Juan Islands. The ship cut north through black water, and fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. I attended the mandatory lifeboat drill, listened to the safety officer's rehearsed speech, and felt the strange vertigo of being surrounded by 3,000 strangers who would never know my name. That first night I could not sleep. The mattress was fine, the room was quiet, but my mind would not settle. Around 2 a.m, I gave up and decided to walk. The Windjammer Cafe on Deck 11 keeps coffee available all night for insomniacs like me. I took the stairs, preferring the exercise to the elevator's mechanical hum. Near the observation deck, I found a crew member mopping the floor beside the forward hot tub. He wore the white uniform of housekeeping staff, and his name tag read Nestor. I held the door so he could push his cart through. He thanked me in a soft accent, Filipino, I guessed, and we exchanged a few words about the fog and the cold. Out here, surrounded by nothing but water and darkness, conversation with a stranger felt oddly necessary. I asked how long he had been at sea. 9 contracts, he said, which meant 9 years with only brief visits home to Manila. His wife and 3 children were there. He sent money every month. He mopped in slow, methodical circles as he spoke, never pausing, as though the rhythm kept him steady. I mentioned that the hot tubs seemed popular despite the cold. At that, Nestor stopped. He leaned on the mop handle, studying me for a moment, as though deciding whether I could be trusted with something heavy. "You want to hear something that will ruin hot tubs for you?" he asked. The way he said it, quiet and factual, made me nod. Nestor glanced around the empty deck. "Last April," he began, "a man died in the starboard hot tub. First night out of Seattle. No one noticed for 3 hours." He told me the story without embellishment, the way someone recites a checklist. His name was Denton Krebs, 53 years old, an insurance adjuster from Spokane. He was traveling with his wife and teenage son. After dinner, he slipped away from the welcome show and went to the hot tub alone. The security footage reviewed later showed him entering the water at 9:34 in the evening. He leaned back, adjusted his sunglasses, and never moved again. Cardiac arrest. That is what the ship's doctor wrote in the report. But for hours, no one realized. The live band played on the opposite side of the pool deck, and the steam rose thick in the cold air, wrapping around him like a shroud. His head rested against the molded cushion. His arms floated at his sides. He looked asleep, maybe drunk, but nothing more alarming than that. Between 10 and midnight, at least 8 other passengers used the same hot tub. A young couple sat less than 2 feet from him, laughing about the drink specials. An older man dipped in, decided the water was too hot, and climbed out. 2 women in their 40s talked about shore excursions, their voices bright and oblivious, just inches from his face. "People do not look at strangers," Nestor said. "We glance, we judge, we look away." The body stayed upright because of the water jets and the natural buoyancy. Nothing about his posture screamed danger. Everything changed when Arjun, the night supervisor, came through on his closing rounds. At 12:18, Arjun tapped the edge of the tub to announce it was time to clear the area. The couple climbed out. Denton Krebs stayed. Arjun spoke louder, assuming the man was drunk or stubborn. When he reached down to nudge the man's shoulder, his hand sank too deep, the flesh wrong under his palm. The body folded sideways, slipping beneath the foam. Arjun shouted, and within seconds, 3 more crew members arrived. They pulled him out onto the deck, water streaming from his Radiance of the Seas swim trunks, and tried to resuscitate him. The ship's physician, Dr. Lenore Pruitt, pronounced him dead at 12:24. Nestor delivered these details in a flat, steady voice. When he finished, the only sound was the hiss of water jets and the low groan of the ship's hull cutting through the Pacific. I realized my coffee had gone cold in my hand. "What happened to the family?" I asked. "Staff Captain Morrison told them at 1 in the morning, Nestor said. "They flew home from Juneau 2 days later. The cruise line comped everything, but no one else knew. The next morning, the Calypso band played. The buffet served eggs Benedict. Life continued." I thanked him, though I was not sure why, and walked back to my cabin. I did not sleep. The next 2 days passed in a fog that had nothing to do with the weather. We docked in Juneau, and I walked through the town with my camera, photographing totem poles and bald eagles. But Nestor's story stayed with me like a stain. Every time I passed the pool deck, I saw that starboard hot tub glowing turquoise under its LEDs, steam rising into the cold air. And I thought about Denton Krebs sitting there for 3 hours while strangers laughed around him. On Saturday night, we were sailing toward Skagway. The ship cut through calm water under a moonless sky. Most passengers were at the late show in the theater, a comedian from Las Vegas doing crowd work. I was restless again, so I walked. I found myself on deck 11, near the observation lounge. The pool deck was nearly empty, and there, in the starboard hot tub, sat a single man. He was older than me, maybe 60, wearing a Seattle Mariners cap and prescription sunglasses despite the darkness. His head was tilted back against the cushion, his arms floating at his sides. An empty cocktail glass sat on the edge near his left hand. I stood by a deck chair, pretending to check my phone. The man did not move. 5 minutes passed. The only sign of life was the faint ripple of water across his chest from the jets. My pulse quickened. I stepped closer. "You okay, buddy?" No response. I cleared my throat louder. "Hey, you need help?" Nothing. His chest rose and fell, but the movements were shallow, wrong. I had worked around enough machinery to recognize when a system was failing. I moved to the edge of the tub and tapped his knee. "Sir, can you hear me?" His head lolled slightly to one side, mouth parting, but no words came. I saw it then, the wedding ring on his left hand, catching the underwater lights. Something about that ring, still on his finger, made my chest tighten. I hit the red emergency button on the wall. No siren, just a silent strobe that flashed somewhere below deck. Within 60 seconds, 2 security officers appeared, followed by a medic in a white polo carrying an orange bag. They moved fast, efficient, lifting him under the arms. Water cascaded onto the deck. One officer asked if I had seen him drinking. "There's an empty glass," I said, pointing. They laid him flat on a towel. The medic applied an oximeter to his finger and pressed a pocket mask over his mouth, forcing air into his lungs. His pulse was there, faint, but present. Blood alcohol would later be measured at 0.28. They loaded him onto a stretcher and disappeared toward the elevator. Only then did I notice Nestor standing near the railing, mop in hand, watching. Our eyes met. He gave a small nod, like a teacher acknowledging a student who had finally learned the lesson. The hot tub churned on. Empty now, steam curling into the night. The next morning, the cruise director made a cheerful announcement over the PA system. A passenger had experienced a brief medical event and was resting comfortably in the infirmary. All services remained on schedule. Passengers applauded before turning their attention to the omelet station. I found Nestor later that afternoon near the crew stairwell. He told me the man's name was Virgil Tench, 61, a retired postal worker from Tacoma. His wife had died 6 months earlier from cancer. He had been drinking alone since boarding, trying to drown something that would not stay down. "He will go home with a story," Nestor said. "But he will go home." We stood in silence, the floor vibrating beneath us from the engines. I asked how he managed the weight of it, working where vacation and tragedy share the same deck. Nestor shrugged. "The ocean is big," he said. "We can only keep our eyes open." On the final morning, dawn broke pale over the inside passage as we angled back toward Seattle. I stood on my balcony with black coffee and watched the crew prepare for disembarkation. Somewhere below on deck 3, the ship's small morgue sat empty this voyage, its refrigerated compartment silent and unused. The pool deck loungers were still wet from overnight cleaning, their white straps glistening in the early light. Crew members folded towels into swans, arranging them on each chair so the first passengers would feel welcomed. Vacation brochures never show the narrow steel door labeled bereavement services. They do not mention that most large cruise ships carry body bags, because death rarely respects itineraries. They do not tell you that a man can die surrounded by people, and no one will notice because we have trained ourselves not to see. Standing there in the cold morning air, I understood something I had been avoiding since my divorce. Loneliness is not about being alone. It is about being invisible while surrounded by others. It is about sitting in a hot tub in the middle of the ocean, dying slowly while strangers laugh 2 feet away. I packed my camera and my rain jacket. As the ship glided past the Seattle skyline, I thought about Denton Krebs and Virgil Tench. One man went home in a body bag. The other went home with a second chance he might not remember. I went home with my eyes open, and I have never looked at a hot tub the same way since.